Thanks.
Yeah. All right, they're now flooding in. Welcome to our guests. We'll start in a moment. We'll let you all settle in.
I know this guy. I see Uri's there to encourage you, Urit.
Oh, I don't see anybody on my screen.
Go to attendees,
Uh,
participants, and then attendees.
You can see a list of attendees.
oh, yes, I see. Yeah, I make my friend participate.
All right, shall we start? Okay, so welcome to all our guests. Shana Tova. We are very pleased to host this event today, celebrating the new book by our friend Tamir Sorek, The Optimist, the social biography of Tawfiq Zayyad. Came out a couple of weeks ago by Stanford University Press. Normally, we would have served you some pastry and coffee and tea at that time, but in the virtual world of events right now, we are celebrating the event by having three phenomenal speakers to join us. So before we begin, let me just say that this is our second event this year in the series of Jewish Studies and Middle Eastern History. I want to thank the Department of History and the Program of Jewish Studies here at Penn State for allowing us to do these events. You are welcome to follow us on our Facebook page to get updates on more events that are coming up. And we are delighted to have today with us Professor Orit Bashkin, Professor Leena Dallashe, Professor Maha Nassar, and our new colleague at Penn State, Professor Tamir Sorek. We'll go by alphabetical order. Each speaker will offer their comments for 10 to 15 minutes, and then Tamir will respond, and then we'll open the floor for questions. You are welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll collect answers and raise them later. So our first speaker is Professor Orit Bashkin. She is a professor of modern Middle East history at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Impossible Exodus, Iraqi Jews in Israel, came out with Stanford in 2017. New Babylonians, A History of Jews in Modern Iraq, came out in 2012. And The Other Iraq, Pluralism and Culture in Hashemite Iraq, came out in 2008, all with Stanford University Press. She wrote over 30 articles and book chapters dealing with modern Arab history, the Arab cultural revival in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the connection between literature and history. The floor is yours, Orit.
Okay, thank you. I'm very excited to be talking to you today. And I guess I'm not talking as an expert on Palestine, but more as a fan and as somebody who sort of knows the Communist Party in Israel through the participation of Iraqi Jews in it. But I want to make a few comments how to contextualize this wonderful work that Tamir Sorek produced about a mayor and a politician and a poet by the name of Tawfiq Zayyad, and I'm sure Tamir will tell us more about the book, in sort of larger conversations that are happening in Middle Eastern studies nowadays, and trying to sort of place the work in these conversations. So I noticed that in recent years, we've been returning to history of individuals. So for example, Ila Parsons wrote a beautiful political biography of Fawzi al-Kawukji, who led the volunteers to participate in the 1948 war from Iraq. There's been books by Yoav Elon on the tribal sheikh in Jordan, by Benjamin Fortnow on special operations of the Ottoman Empire, and sort of the Ottoman version of Lawrence of Arabia. And I think that Tamir joins this kind of waves of political biographies by very successfully, and these books do this, successfully reconstructing the networks and the activities of these individuals. And I think this is very relevant to the field of Palestinian studies, where the boundaries between literary activities, cultural activities, political activities, and the conceptualization of literature as an integral part of politics are very much felt. And I'm sure that Maha Nassar can talk more about it, but when we talk about Palestinian history, we see this kind of committed public intellectuals such as Ghassan Kanafani, who was the spokesperson and a member of the Politburo of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a parliament member like Emil Habibi, a poet like Mahmoud Darwish, who conceptualized their literature as part of resistance. And I think that it's very interesting to read Zayyad in this context. I think that the second interesting context to think about Tamir Sorek's work and more generally about the life of somebody like Tawfiq Zayyad is in how it breaks kind of boundaries between national and transnational, and even between religious and secular. So we are used to think about them, or we used to think about them as opposition. We have the transnational that challenges the nation state. We have the secular that challenges the religious. But I think that in the case of Palestine, this is a little bit different. It's much more fluid. So this is a Marxist. This is someone who's committed to a Marxist ideology, to the workers' concerns. This is somebody who rise to power as part of labor unions and workers' organizations. But at the same time, this is someone who's very concerned about the national context and about the rights of his people. And it's interesting to think about Palestine in an era of post-colonial critique, where the era of independence and sovereignty never arrived. And so I think that the book flashes out these tensions between nationalism, communism, transnationalism, in very interesting ways, and it kind of fits debates that I'm familiar with, for example, in the context of Iraqi Jews, who on the one hand were very critical of certain strands of Arab nationalism, but at the same time were kind of at the forefront of conceptualizing what an Arab Jew is and might be. And I think that also in terms of Zayyad's sort of activities as a secular person, that is very much emphasized in its critique of sort of Muslim or Islamist organizations in Palestine, still, and this is again something that Maha Nassar pointed, his familiarity with the Islamic cultural heritage is something that might complicate his ideas of secularity, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. This book adds to a growing body of literature that looks at Palestinians that became Israeli citizens, not as Arab Israelis, not as the integrated Arabs, but rather as victims of colonialism, and trying to look at their modes of resistance. And here again, the book joins works by Leena Dallashe and Shira Robinson and Maha Nassar and others that emphasize the crucial years of martial law, of what is called the military government on Palestine, and more broadly break this kind of Zionist liberal perception that the state of Israel was this kind of ethical entity until the kind of religious waves of settlement post-1967, and problematizing Israel from 1948 onwards. And this book that kind of takes us all the way in Zayyad's life is is quite important. At the same time, because it focuses on Palestinians with Israeli ideas and not on the diaspora, it kind of brings out something that Leena Dallashe works on, and this is the messiness of Israeli politics, of local politics, of city politics. It flashes out the significance of platforms where Palestinians were only to perform there as performing Israeli democracy, such as the Knesset and other venues. And how Palestinians made them much more than a performative act. But I think that unlike the diaspora, that where we sometimes tend to romanticize certain notions, like we as in scholarship, like the armed struggle or the resistance, here it's much more messy. And the platforms are much more complicated, and I'm sure that Leena Dallashe will have more to say about this. And lastly, I think that this is a book about optimism in a sense that 1948 was this kind of devastating trauma. But at the same time, there are different moments in the book where there seem to be like moments where the Arabs around Zayyad or Zayyad himself are thinking that things might change, whether it's 1952 in Egypt, whether it's this kind of global moment of decolonization where, maybe it will be like Cuba, maybe it will be like Vietnam. And these hopes are dashed, but in some moments, like the first Intifada, or the kind of momentarily revival of the radical Israeli left during the war in Lebanon, you can sort of see why there are grounds for optimism. And so in terms of framing the discussions, I just have two questions for Tamir that I think might be interesting to discuss. One is, whether you think as a sociologist that deal with Palestinian society in Israel, that his optimism was justified, whether you look at his optimism as a strategy, despite a very pessimistic reality, whether pessi optimism is perhaps the mode. And secondly, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your work progress. So you talk about a poet, and it's always difficult to sort of piece together works of literature with works, with this kind of broader, brilliant contextualization that you do, without kind of, flattening literary work. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this kind of interactions between literature, politics, and research as you're kind of doing this biography. And I'll end here. And again, it was exciting to read this wonderful work again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Orit. And I'm delighted to introduce now Professor Leena Dallashe. She's an associate professor of history at Humboldt State University. Her research focuses on the history of Palestine, Israel, with particular interest in Palestinians who became citizens of Israel in 1948. She's currently finishing a manuscript on the social and political history of Nazareth from 1940 to 1966, tracing how Palestinians who remained in Israel in 1948 negotiated their incorporation in the state, affirming their rights as citizens and their identity as Palestinian. Her article, Troubled Waters, Governing Waters, Water and Struggling for Citizenship in Nazareth, appeared in IJMES 47, 2015. She also published articles and reviews in the Journal of Palestine Studies and edited collections. She received her PhD in the Joint History and Middle Eastern Studies, Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program at NYU. Before coming to NYU, she received a law degree from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Thank you, Leena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lior, for inviting me to participate. I'm very excited to be a part of this. I'm going to start in a maybe slightly atypical way. And actually read a part of a poem from Tawfiq Zayyad, because I think it's appropriate for the moment. So I'm going to read from a segment called في كل شيء نعيش from من شهداء الحرية 1970, which is a poem that Tamir actually references in the book, but not this segment. And I think, to me, this is very much Tawfiq Zayyad that speaks to me, that has spoken to me. So في كل شيء نعيش، حطوا في رجلي القيد، حطوا في كفي القيد، قصوا صوتي ولساني، وكوا أعضائي بسجائركم، وارموا ماء النار على وجهي، وكلوا لحمي يا محتلين، حطوا في عنقي حبل المشنقة الأسود، حطوا بدني المقتول في لحد داخل لحد، فأنا من شدة حبي لبلادي لا أفنى وأموت، لكن أتجدد دوما أتجدد. ما دامت في أرضي زهرة، ما دامت في وطني صخرة، ما دامت في الأفق سحابة، ما دامت في الأرض ترابا، سأعيش وأحيا في هبة ريح تسري في أنفاس الزهر وأريج الزعتر والعشب البري، في جدول ماء يجري في ليلكة تفهم سري، سأعيش وأحيا أتجدد كل صباح كل دقيقة، في شبابة راع، في تنهيدة أم وربابة شاعر، في ضوء الشمس وفي وشوشة الغاب الساحر، وفي الصمت وفي العاصفة الهوجاء، في خفق جناح طائر، سأعيش وأحيا، سأظل إلى أبد الآباد، أتجدد في وطن الأجداد، فأنا والنصر وشمس الأحرار على ميعاد. To me, this poem, and I'm not going to translate it because I think it needs to sit there in Arabic. To me, this poem is very much about this, what Tamir Sorek describes about Tawfiq Zayyad. And I think in that, the book is, does a very good job in touching at it. As I was reading the book, to me, a lot of these poems came back, and Tamir, I have that version of the book that you actually mentioned from 1970, the print. Because of that, and because of other factors that I'm going to discuss, I think the book is timely and necessary. It comes in a void. So Tawfiq Zayyad is someone who, for Palestinian citizens of Israel, is a household name. Everyone knows who he is. Everyone has an anecdote or a story. Everyone heard about him. I mean, I personally have, somewhere there's a picture of me on his shoulder in a demonstration as a kid, but even those who did not grow up in communist households know him because of the particular personality he had. And yet there was really no extensive research of his work and life. So in that context, the book is a very welcome addition to fill that void. But the book is also timely and necessary because it engages, as Orit mentioned, in an ongoing discussion about the history of Palestinians in Israel and their relation with the state, along with their internal dynamics. And this discussion is not only academic, but it is an internal Palestinian discussion, which tries to reevaluate this history and to better understand not only how we got here, but also what lessons can we learn from this history? How do we explore the strategies? How do we understand the strategies that Palestinian citizens used in the early years of the encounter with the state? And how can these be further developed in order to understand, in order to continue the work that has been done, or by other standards, rectify that? And within this discussion, there's also been a less than subtle conflict over the role of communists within this history, and particularly the assessment of whether their actions and policies were heroism or treason. And Sorek's work here interjects into this discussion by taking it away from the dichotomy to present a nuanced perspective, one that takes the historical actors, and particularly Zayyad, seriously. In this exploration of Zayyad's life, literature, and politics, Sorek allows for Zayyad's beliefs and ideas to take form and places them within the social and historical context while also critically engaging them. Rather than glorify or vilify, the book gives the readers an opportunity to understand communist actions and policies from their perspective within the realm of their political possibilities and imaginations. And this is something that is crucially needed in this revisiting of this history. Because one of the things that keep happening is people who judge history from this perspective, from our perspective. Once you know the outcome, it's not very complicated to tailor a story, except our historical actors, as I always tell my undergrads, didn't know. that it's going to end that way. So I think in that sense, allowing the voices, limited as they might be, which is going to be the next point I'm going to talk about, allowing those voices to still come through and enable us to take these historical actors on their own terms rather than our contemporary ones is a really, really important contribution of this book. The second observation I wanted to bring up is that the book highlights the challenges of writing the history of the marginalized and colonized, the stateless. It is true, the book is about a poet, a political activist, who was also a part of a state apparatus. He was a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and a mayor. And yet, before and above all, I argue, was a Palestinian, one of those who became stateless in 1948, even as he gained citizenship in the state that was created in his homeland. And until today, Palestinians continue to be without a state or state institutions and without national archives. In the absence of such institutions, narrating the history of the Palestinians becomes an adventure in what would be fit for teaching historical method classes. How do we narrate the silenced history? Sorek worked very hard to face this challenge, and the book is the evidence of the extensive research that tries to relocate the fragments of Zayyad's and through that Palestinians' history. He combines archival research with newspaper articles, Zayyad's writings, and extensive interviews to offer a detailed and nuanced picture of the history of Palestinians as they experienced the dispossession and loss of 48 and the attempts to recreate their lives within the state and to renegotiate the parameters of the state and shape it as they went at it. And I think this is another very powerful contribution of this book, because it is really challenging and it is very hard. And I could imagine, and we've had some conversations, Tamir and I, while he was doing the project, but I could imagine the extremely complicated process of trying to piece together this history. I personally went to 11 archives, in addition to trying to get private collections and interviews, and that's a part of this process. And I think this is something that we have to be very cognizant of. The book has omissions and blanks that are, Tamir is not even subtle about it. They're actually a part of that story there, right? Because they are an important part of this story. What we don't know is actually sometimes as important as what we do know. And I think this is something that really comes through in the book in a very powerful way. And my third point is connected to this challenge in telling this history. While Sorek refers to the tensions within the party, the Communist Party, and particularly between the Arab and Jewish members, and alludes to the power dynamics within the party and Zayyad's role within it, this issue could be more developed in the book. The party's reunification in October 1948 was one that replicated the power structure within the country and in which the Palestinians were defeated and subordinated to the Israeli control. Particularly during the first decade and before Rakach's creation, this meant that Zayyad, along with Tuma and Habibi and others, had to compromise, present their ideas in more conciliatory, less national, less scary terms, not only to the Jewish audiences, but also to the Palestinian audiences, lest it be translated and misreceived. The book tells of several instances in which Zayyad faces rebuke for crossing that line. And to me, it raises the larger question about how that line was set and negotiated. I'm of course aware that since Zayyad himself didn't leave a record to elaborate on this question, and with the absence of records of the party itself, except for the partial materials in Yad Tabenkin, and the National Library, it would be hard to engage in these questions, but I do believe that it is still necessary to understand not only Palestinians' history in Israel, but also the history of the Israeli left. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leena. I'm delighted to introduce the third speaker today, Dr. Maha Nassar. She's an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. She holds a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. Her book, Brothers Apart, Palestinian Citizens of Israel and the Arab World, published with Stanford University Press in 2017, received the 2018 Palestine Book Award for academic titles. In it, she examines how Palestinian intellectuals in Israel connected to global decolonization movement through literary and journalistic writings. Her research also examines how Palestinians have engaged with the Black freedom movement in the United States. Dr. Nassar's analysis and opinion pieces have appeared in The Washington Post, The Conversation, The Hill, and elsewhere. She is currently working on her next book titled The Palestinians, A Global History. Thank you very much, Maha. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Lior, for inviting me. And thank you to Leena and Orit for your very thought-provoking comments. And of course, thanks to Tamir Sorek for writing this really important and I think really in many ways groundbreaking book. And I'll tell you a little bit more what I mean by that. So as Lior mentioned in my book, Brothers Apart, I talk about how Palestinian citizens of Israel, and in particular intellectuals and the so-called resistance poets, of which Tawfiq Zayyad was a part of that, used literary and journalistic writings to challenge Israeli state authorities and also reach out to the Arab world and to decolonial and anti-colonial sentiments throughout the world. As such, and as a result of that, Tawfiq Zayyad has really become immortalized for Palestinian side of the Green Line. He's immortalized as a resistance poet. He's been immortalized as the hero of Land Day. He's become part of the pantheon of Palestinian heroes alongside Mahmoud Darwish and Ghassan Kanafani and others. And to the extent that literature, that academic studies have talked about him and his work, including my own, they tend to focus more on the earlier period when that indeed was the sort of primary driving factor and force in his life. What I think Tamir Sorek's book does so brilliantly and so effectively and so needed in many ways was by expanding the temporal scope and incorporating all of Tawfiq Zayyad's life into a single study. We have a much deeper understanding of his own intellectual journey, as well as the contradictions and the tensions, some of which Leena's already talked and touched upon, so I don't want to dwell too much on that. I think that some of these contradictions, particularly vis-a-vis the idea of his relationship and his relationality with Palestinians in the occupied territories, with Palestinians in Israel, and with Palestinians in the diaspora, is actually captured really poignantly in the opening segment and the opening scene in chapter 7. So I won't read all of it, but I'll kind of summarize it a little bit. So chapter 7 opens with the following scene. So it's 1980, and there's a work camp in Nazareth in which volunteers, Palestinian volunteers from Nablus and Ramallah, brought Palestinian flags with them, and they wanted to raise them as part of the work camp demonstration. Now, typically, in keeping with the ideology and the political stance of Rekah and the Israeli Communist Party, Israeli flags would be raised at Israeli Communist Party events. So these participants, these volunteers who are coming from the occupied West Bank, want to raise Palestinian flag, do not want the Israeli flag to be raised in the opening ceremony. Now, this is also important timeline-wise because that same year, the Israeli government had outlawed the raising of the Palestinian flag. And so during the opening ceremony, volunteers from the West Bank raised the Palestinian flag in the presence of the Israeli police. And then Sorek describes, quotes from journalist David Halavi, what happens next. So Tawfiq Zayyad leaves the stage, runs between the seats, jumps above the people standing in his way, and disappears inside the gathering around the flag. After a minute, following a loud argument, he leaves with the Palestinian flag. With much gentleness and respect, he folds the flag and hands it to an usher who takes it away. Around the rebelling group from Birzeit College, the argument continues. Zayyad returns to his place on the stage. So this scene, and it is very vividly portrayed, so you can kind of imagine his kind of lurching into this group, taking the flag against the objections of everyone, but then treating it so respectfully and gently and folding it and ushering it away. And I think this vignette kind of highlights in many ways, or is a microcosm of much of what Tamir Sorek does in the book, which is to bring out this tension, this thin line, this fine line that Tawfiq Zayyad was walking his entire life. So he was a fervent internationalist, communist internationalist, but he was also very much a Palestinian and a believer in Palestinian national self-determination. He was a Palestinian nationalist, but a member for decades in the Israeli Knesset. He's in the Israeli Knesset, but he has a history of being anti-establishment, being arrested, jailed, tortured, etc. He was a victim of torture, but he also supports the Rabin government in 1992. He was a committed intellectual and political poet, but he was also a mayor of a city dealing with the mundane issues of day-to-day governance. He utilizes very beautiful, as we heard with Leena's rendition of his poem. He was a beautiful poet and had a way with very elegant Arabic. But as also Tamir brings out in the book, he could be quite crude in his, especially when he was angry, especially when he was triggered. I have a feeling it's sort of inferred that there's a bit of a body side to him, perhaps, especially when he'd had something to drink. So, so he was a poet, but he also had this other side to him. He championed the idea of two states for two people, but not as a means of separation, which is what we typically think of two-staters as sort of the motivation behind their ideas. So he was a believer in the idea of two states for two people, but as a way to integrate the people together. He was secular to the point of atheism, but yet he held those beliefs with a messianic fervor that we often associate with those who hold deeply religious beliefs. He was an idealist and an optimist in all of the ways that Tamir's book brings out. Yet, as we see with the flag scene, he was also always a pragmatist as well. So these tensions, these contradictions, the ways in which the sort of messiness, but also the clarity of Tawfiq Zayyad's life and his thoughts and his beliefs is something that I didn't know about before reading this book. And I think many people, even those who study Tawfiq Zayyad sort of academically, I don't think the depth of his humanity really comes out until one reads this book, frankly. I think the second thing that I want to say about this is that the thin lines that Tamir Sorek brings out in this book also helps us understand the widely differing perspectives and images that people have of Tawfiq Zayyad. So he champions two states, he raises the Israeli flag, he serves in the Knesset, yet we read over and over again Zionist press reports that portray him as the antithesis of what he actually believed in, that he was Hitler and fascist and anti-Israel and all of these things that when you actually read the book itself, you're like, wait a minute, where is this coming from? It's clear that Tawfiq Zayyad was very much a family man, as comes out in the interviews with his family members, and yet he's portrayed by the Islamists as having no moral capabilities whatsoever. He also, though, has he has personality traits that also don't come out in political studies of Zayyad, that come out in this work. So his rivalry with Amin Habibi, and you can feel the pain as you read the pages, how painful this severing of a friendship was for both men that were involved. And I was pained reading it. I was like, oh, I love these people so much, and to see them fighting like this, it was tragic. But at the same time, you can see how that happened. You can see why it is that Zayyad's personality would be off-putting to people, that his fervent messianism and belief in Marxism, coming as it does and continuing as it does in the late 80s and into the 90s, seems out of place as times change and as societies change and as people's intellectual currents change. So these are some of the things that I think come out in Tamir Sorek's book that I think really help us get a much more concrete understanding of who Tawfiq Zayyad is, but also who he is in the context of a wider Palestinian society that itself is undergoing changes over this long period of time. And so that actually takes me to my questions. I have a couple of questions. The first is, the subtitle of the book is A Social Biography of Tawfiq Zayyad. And so I'd like perhaps Tamir could talk a little bit more about what he thinks a social biography does that a regular biography or a political biography doesn't do. And then my second question is, given Zayyad's reputation and his relationship and his position within the Palestinian national body writ large, so beyond just Palestinians in Israel, the sort of global Palestinian community, I'm interested to hear about how Tawfiq Zayyad particularly dealt with the more Qawmi Arab, the pan-Arab nationalists. I'm thinking about groups like Abna al-Balad and individuals who maybe weren't as active in parliamentary or Knesset elections, but who had very clear understandings and very clear political positions about binationalism versus two states, about Palestinian self-determination, about their relationship or what their relationship should be with the state of Israel, and so forth. So I will stop there, and thank you again for writing the book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha. Before I reintroduce Tamir Sorek, let me just say, well, two things. One is that after I read this book for the first time, I told Tamir that I don't care that he described himself a sociologist. For me, he's an honorary historian, because this is a historian's work. And second, which I should have mentioned earlier, 20% discount on this book on Stanford University Press website when you enter the discount code Sorek20. So use your rights. And now I'll reintroduce Tamir. Tamir Sorek completed his PhD in sociology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 2002. He previously taught at the University of Maryland, Bar-Ilan University, and Cornell University. And this semester he's completing 14 years at the University of Florida. From January 2020, he will be liberal arts, January 2021. He will be he will be a liberal arts professor of Middle East history at Penn State. He studies social, political, and cultural dynamics that shape collective identities in Palestine, Israel, and is particularly interested in the interrelation between power and culture. Sorek is the author of Arab Soccer in a Jewish State, came out in 2007 by Cambridge University Press, and Palestinian Commemoration in Israel, Stanford University Press, 2015. And of course, the book that brought us all to celebrate it, The Optimist, the Social Biography of Tawfiq Zayyad. Tamir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, thank you very much, Lior, for organizing this event. And for inviting these amazing speakers. Thank you for the Department of History and Jewish Studies at Penn State for hosting this event. And I would like to thank Orit, Leena, and Maha for their very generous reading and very illuminating comments. And I would like to refer to some of the points that you made here. And I will go in the reverse order of the speakers. And so I will begin with some comments of Maha. And the first thing is not part of the formal questions, but there was a minor question in the middle about all the way Zayyad was seen by Zionist writers and politicians, and seeing them as this demon with bad intentions and bad character, basically a villain. And where does it come from? I think I answer this question in the book when I say that it surely does not come from Zayyad, because you could see it comes from the anxieties of those actors, the anxieties of those actors about their place in the space, their place in the Middle East, their security. It comes surely from there, and I think it comes very in a very evident way in the book itself. Now regarding the subtitle, A Social Biography. Throughout the process, I had in mind not only historians who read me, not only sociologists, but literary scholars. I was concerned about literary scholars because I do not deal with literary theory. I put it aside. I do not criticize, I do not, first, it is not my field, so I do not have the tools, the analytical tools to analyze it as literary scholars. And I did not want anyone to expect that I will provide a literary biography of Tawfiq Zayyad. So this is the reason the social is there. I would like to add that my decision to title it as social even strengthened after I read one of the external reviewers that was most likely was a literary scholar that was extremely critical that I did not deal with literary theory. So even though I wrote in the first version that I do not do literary theory, I re-emphasize it just, okay, this is not what I'm doing. And I choose social rather than political because first, I believe that everything is political. So I don't think there is social without the political. But because sometimes the term political is understood as party politics, I wanted to emphasize that this is what I'm doing. So this is the rationale between the subtitle, Social Biography. So now regarding the reference to Zayyad to Arab nationalism, to the Qawmiya, and to Abna and Balad and other groups. I think the first confrontation we see when Zayyad has to relate to it in a very explicit way was in the late 50s, when Abdel Nasser persecuted communists. And it put communists in the region in a very uncomfortable position. They had basically to pick sides between Nasser and between their loyalty to their brother communists elsewhere. And certainly in the case of the Communist Party inside Israel, they picked the communist side. But I think Zayyad was more extreme in this regard, and you know this more than anyone else in your book. You made a clear reference to that, and I even quoted you, Maha, there. For him, it was a personal issue of being referred to as an agent, a traitor. He took it very personal, and he went personally after Gamal Abdel Nasser, something that is unheard of in the political atmosphere at the side. I think his political party paid in electoral coin, in electoral currency for what he did, but he went with his belief all the way. So this is one historical juncture when he was to make a position toward general trends of Pan-Arabism in the region. It was not something against Pan-Arabism, but it was against Nasserism at the time. Now, his treatment of Abna al-Balad was not, I don't have very many reference to Abna al-Balad, and when there is, it is quite positive. His confrontation was with the progressive movement and with the progressive list, which was in some way partly overlapping on Abna al-Balad, but is certainly not the same. And for him, his party, sorry, Leena?
Electoral question.
It was an electoral question. And for him, and I think he believed in it, and many people in his party believe in it, that the progressive list was a creation of the Israeli authorities. It was a conspiracy against the communists, and they did not see them as a legitimate political power in any way. You could see it even in the internal discussions of the Communist Party. They see them as a major enemy in the mid-80s. They make lots of effort in discredit them. At the same time, Zayyad was very pragmatic. Before the elections of 1992, he tried to create a very wide political alliance that will include both Meretz and the progressive list. This is so pretentious. You should be really an optimist in order to create something. So he did want them inside. He did want to cooperate with them, even though you could see in several points right away that he felt personally attacked against them. The amount of the emotion there against the progressive list could be compared only with the amount of the emotion that are involved in his struggle against the Islamic movement. It was certainly an issue. But I don't think it is something against Pan-Arabism, because you could see in his poetry that his Pan-Arabism is there, not to the same extent of Samih al-Qasim. Samih al-Qasim's poetry, Pan-Arabism is there, Palestinian nationalism is not there, really. It's mostly about Pan-Arabism. This is not the case of Tawfiq Zayyad. In this balance between Palestinian particularism and Pan-Arabism is much more in the Palestinian side. But he certainly has a significant solidarity with Arabs elsewhere. And you could see it in Lebanon and in Egypt, and he's writing about it. But thank you for these questions that let me clarify these elements. Leena, first, I would like to say that the poet that you quoted that you like so much and I like so much is in the book. So at least it's not in the same length that you brought here, but some of these lines that you quoted here, these are the end of the book. This is where I choose to end the book with it because my, I think the hope that these lines bring. It is there, and I'm happy it is there. So regarding the power balance between Jews and Arabs in the party, first, I fully agree with you that this is a major issue that shapes the Arab discourse in the party. And it is certainly evident after 1948, they're cautious, they're very cautious. As you know, my previous book was about cautious commemoration. So I'm aware of that. It might be that it did not come through enough in the book in order to emphasize how crucial it was. Maybe it is possible because I wrote so much about these cautious in my previous book. I didn't feel like I maybe I have to re-explain it, but I was not aware about how my readers might read it. But I agree with you that this is a crucial power in order to understand how the Arab members of our party were operating, their relation with the Jewish members. I have no doubt about it. Orit, you asked me about the practice of connecting poetry and politics. I tried to read the entire poetic work of Tawfiq Zayyad. I think I covered at least the published work, and I read it in different stages of my work, and I tried, and this is I think this is the work of a social historian or a political sociologist when I read poetry, unlike what someone from the literary field does. When I read it, I tried to extract political themes from the poetry, and to find where I can find political messages. It's easy when you read it, but to find the the dominant themes, but also to find biographical trace, to see how there are some certain historical changes, historical turn points, which are expressed in the poetry. And so there are several moments, like the one moment I mentioned earlier, the Nassar is communist moment. but also there is this moment of the first Intifada that partly is responsible for the fact that Tawfiq Zayyad returned to write. The themes of children that came very strongly in this period, and I think it is related to the vulnerability of children during the Second Intifada, but also to Zayyad's personal life with the injury of his daughter at the time. So it was a reading with looking for these political themes and historical and biographical turning point. This is the way I was reading it. And obviously, I couldn't quote everything. I really had to limit myself to really selected lines, and this is what I did. What I would like to say that the way poetry and politics are most strongly connected are in the years of silence. These years between the moment Zayyad became a Knesset member in early 1974, and until he resigned and left the Knesset for 2 years, it was in between 1990 and 1992. In those 16 years, there is a silence. He's not writing. And I think this is something that tells a lot about the relations between poetry and politics. Because poetry was the revolutionary, romantic, utopic, theological aspect of Tawfiq Zayyad. This is where his dialogue and even flirt with the sublime, with the other world, with the transcendence, where he could imagine this the utopian world that he's trying to realize here. This was incompatible with the mundane work of the parliament, of going into the stage. And by the way, most of his speeches in the Knesset are not speeches, they are not poetic. He brings a lot of statistics and numbers. He took it very seriously, it's many times it's very dry. When he was provoked, he started by the right-wing member of the parliament. Yeah, okay, so sometimes he started to curse, but the written script that he wrote for himself when he stood on the podium was very dry. He intentionally did not bring poetry, and I think emotionally he could not bring his poetry to the podium. Poetry did not belong to the mundane political work that, as a Palestinian in the Israeli Knesset, needed so much compromise, so much putting aside your frustrations and your sense of urgency and your anger. You had to put this aside when you are there. So this is why he separated poetry from his political activism in the Knesset, not from his political activism generally. As a politician, before he was elected, he used poetry in his speeches, okay? There is one moment when he brought poetry into the podium, and this is in the euphoric moments during the first stage of the Oslo process, when he was optimistic about it. And there was a moment when he felt that he can combine them. And this was a very rare moment. But even then, even in this period, I don't think he wrote any poetry during the Oslo process itself. I did not find any poetry he wrote. Maybe the one humoristic poet he wrote in Hebrew about Gandhi. There is something, but you cannot really consider it poetry. So this is about the relations between poetry.
Clarify who Gandhi is for the audience, so they don't get.
Gandhi was Rechavam Ze'evi. This was his full name. He belonged to an extreme right party that explicitly preached for expelling Palestinians, voluntary expulsion. This is how he called it. But Gandhi put Zayyad at the spot of his criticism whenever he wanted to criticize the government. That was Rabin's government was basically dependent on Zayyad's vote, so he criticized Zayyad and blaming Rabin for collaborating with Zayyad. So so this is the current.
Maybe we should liberate the name Gandhi from Ze'evi.
Oh yeah, I think maybe I should not use the term Gandhi. You are right. So Rehavam Ze'evi would be the right name to use. And now
Sexual harasser, rapist also works.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, another elements, another important elements in his biography that Leena added, and we should remember when we remember the person. So now about optimism, which I came into the last because this is the theme of the book. So whether the optimism was justified. If we look at the immediate level, the concrete optimism of Zayyad on every single turn, we can say no, it was not justified. Okay, until today, the goals he had in mind were not achieved. At least the geostrategic goal. Maybe in developing, in one sense, in maybe mobilizing the Palestinians in Israel for collective action. Maybe here there is a certain success, and it is partly because of the work of Zayyad and his generation. But generally, if you look at where the Palestinians are today, you cannot say that it was justified. Certainly, you cannot say that the Oslo process that Zayyad was so optimistic about at the time, that the optimism was justified. I think there is no, there cannot be disagreement that at least in the point where we are now, it cannot be justified. But optimism is a state of mind. And here you cannot distinguish between the strategy and the state of mind, because the state of mind is the strategy. And you cannot do political work without having this state of mind. So what I'm saying is that it was not instrumental in the sense that Tawfiq Zayyad pretended to be optimistic. It was instrumental because it served a purpose, but this was his state of mind. And because it was his state of mind, he was able to mobilize people. So when and now I go back to the partial success of his political project, and this is the mobilization of the Palestinians in Israel for collective action. That it is, Land Day is a landmark in this process, and Tawfiq Zayyad has certainly rights both in mobilizing people for action in Land Day, but also in building the memory of Land Day as a focal point for political mobilization. I think in this regard, the optimism that he had could be justified. And I think if we want ever to have successful and efficient political action, we need this optimism. And one last comment is that this optimism lies exactly at the point where we question the boundaries between secularism and religiosity. Because I don't think that you can have this optimism, this faith, without certain points of real faith. And this faith is spiritual, it is religious in nature, and it puts question mark to what extent the secular rationalist political work can work without this element, element of
of religiosity, not in the sense of following certain scripts, but in the sense of faith and belief that there could be a better world somewhere.
If I might add here, if you don't mind, that I think there's also a larger Palestinian context to this optimism, because if you think about it, it is a topic that does repeat. And I think it has to do with the historical fact of being completely crushed and defeated. So you know, when you were talking about the last point, I was thinking about Mahmoud Darwish, who's not an optimist in most of our minds, right? If you read his poetry, I mean, some of it gets pretty dark, but in حالة حصار, he says, you know, نفعل ما يفعل السجناء وما يفعل العاطلون عن العمل نربي الأمل, right? There's a necessity within the Palestinian project to recreate hope, I think, that is a part of this process that I think Tawfiq Zayyad is very involved in it. I mean, I agree with your reading, but I think it is a part of a larger project. And I think you do convincingly show in the book that there is that messianic zeal in his optimism that goes beyond. But I think it still kind of could be placed within a larger, like, even if you look at the Pes Optimist, it's eventually kind of a part of that spectrum, right? Like, you know, the part of the Pes Optimist I always remember the most is when she says, you know, he fell off the boat and died. And then she says, Alhamdulillah, right? Like he you know, thank God. And he says, what could be worse? Right? There's like, she's still optimistic even after he falls off the boat and dies. And but there's that kind of need to manufacture hope in order to persevere, I think, that is a part of this project.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, there are discussions about futurity and how individuals imagine the future. So when I'm thinking just randomly about, you know, works in Palestinian literature that I know, the ways in which the future is envisioned is also a matter of context, right? So if we think about Ghassan Kanafani, 1964, the Palestinians are stuck in a truck, they're shouting and nobody listens to them. If I'm thinking Aidil Haifa, post-1967, there's a moment of hope in the armed resistance. When I'm thinking about the Pesi Optimists, I'm thinking about people that are stuck on a chazuk, which becomes kind of a historical metaphor later on. So I think that with Zayyad, I mean, from the context that I know, there's the communist issue, right? That you have to ask yourself questions about consciousness and wherein the workers' revolution will come. And then you have to sort of interpret everything that history brings on you, from Nasserism to the rise of Likud to Camp David, according to some prescribed lines that the theory gives you, and interpret them according to this slide. But what I got from the book is that it's kind of a combination between personality and zeal and messianism, and again, maybe a mechanism, as you said, a mechanism of survival. And so, you know, but I think, again, the future is also contextual in some ways.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, so we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. You can use the Q&A function or raise your hand if you know how to do it, and I can open the mic for you. But we have an opener from your brother. Your brother Asi writes that he knows how pessimistic you are in relation to Israel. Do you find the optimism of Tawfiq Zayyad, did you catch some of it to believe that a better world can exist there?
Throughout the process, sometimes I was called by optimism, but the fact that I'm not a politician makes it easier for me to sink in despair. I guess if I, you know, had I been in a politician and doing a political work all the time, I would have been maybe more optimistic. I think the political practice fills you with optimism because you have to. As long when I deep inside the writing, the analysis, it pushes me toward the pessimistic side. And it is a reminder that we should be more involved politically to be filled with optimism.
Wow, this should be the closer, I think, on this on this note. If we don't get any other questions in the coming minute, I want to ask you something that is, it's a step away from the discussion. Because, you know, I read the book as someone who works on communism in the Middle East. And I wanted to know what do you think the biography of Tawfiq Zayyad tells us, you know, his biography, but also the way that you read the Israeli Communist Party. What do you think can we learn anything about Middle Eastern communism through this biography, through the Israeli Communist Party, through Palestinian communism?
About regional communism, you know, I'm not sure that we can learn much from this. The story of the Israeli Communist Party, and before this, the Palestinian Communist Party, is so unique in this, at least to the best of my knowledge. I'm not enough an expert of other Communist Party, but the dynamics are so unique. The Nakba is something that did not happen in any other Middle Eastern context. And the active colonial character of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict till this day makes it really an extreme case that I'm not sure we can learn much about other contexts. But since both you and Orit are experts of communist parties elsewhere, maybe you have a different perspective about it.
Orit?
It's depressing all over. I mean, I think that there's the particularities of the Palestinian situation, but I think, you know, you see in certain moments in history this kind of optimism, and you see the optimism of the activists. But thinking about the communists in Iraq or in Syria, it's a different history because, again, it's not a denial of sovereignty and citizenship and justice and water and return and the things that are characteristic of the Palestinian case. But in terms of being, you know, brutally defeated by your own country, in terms of police violence, torture, and so on, these are very horrific tales in some ways. And so, you know, and it's also like the oppression is from your own people and different kind of post-colonial elite rather than a different kind of colonizer. So, but the challenges, you know, of Arab nationalism, how to deal with 1952, which many people see as a moment of hope, and they have their own criticisms, how to deal with Arab nationalism, those kinds of debates are similar in many places in the Middle East. I think Iran is different, so Lior will talk about Iran.
But I also do think that we should give some credence or some attention to the fact that they did view themselves as a part of a larger movement, right? They did place themselves, right? Even the Iranian Communist Party, right? They do reference today, they do reference, you know, Zayyad himself writes about Nadim Hikmat and translates Nadim Hikmat, who's the Turkish communist, right? So there is like, in the book, like I was reading this moment where they meet Bakdash and it's like their hero, right? Like this is what sticks to them from this whole thing, is that they meet Khalid Bakdash. So in that sense, I think we should give credence to the fact that they do view themselves as a part of this larger movement, even as they're experiencing something that is extremely radically different, right? So they're the internationalism.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tension that Maha writes about.
Dear friends, to talk about optimism in 2020 is not a small feat. I want to thank you all for the beautiful discussion, and Tamir, thank you. Oh well, now questions are coming in. You know what? I'll since people raise them, let's address them. The first question comes from Adel Mohsen. This is a bit of technical question. Do you happen to know what presses publishers put out Zayyad works in Israel? Was he one of those writers, publishers who owned his own press?
No, the Communist Party published stuff, but there were also like some publishers that were related in one way or another to the Communist Party. But certainly no, he did not have his own press.
Lior and Akka. Lior and Akka published a few.
Lior and Akka, yeah, they did a lot of these publications.
And Tamir Sorek asks, if you were born as a Palestinian in Ramallah, what do you believe would have been your study field? And so what next? What is your next project?
Look, I believe that I would have studied in Ramallah, I would have studied the occupation. This is the first thing that comes to mind when I think about what would have been. Certainly, I would have not studied Palestinian soccer in Israel. This is a very risky project that you do when you have the privilege to do it, not when you live under occupation. That's for sure.
So now I want to thank all of you for this beautiful discussion, and I want to thank the attendees of this webinar. Follow our Facebook page, and Shana Tova to all of us, and get this book. Highly recommended. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.